Microsoft Azure can be managed from a web-based portal or from the PowerShell command line environment. Microsoft Azure can be managed from a web-based portal or from the PowerShell command line environment. I'm Aaron Sampson, and in this course I'll explain basic administration, virtual networks, and how to form hybrid networks. To get started then, in this presentation we are going to take a look at the basic characteristics of cloud computing. And at its core is the idea of self-service and on-demand solutions. Once you have your subscription, it is entirely up to you as to what applications, what services, what infrastructure you require, and you can create and configure them anytime, whenever you want. It is entirely up to you. So this creates a very elastic, very flexible environment wherein if you decide we need 10 more virtual machines, go ahead and create them. If an old application is no longer needed, you can decommission it and remove it at any point in time. Again, entirely up to you, and you can access that on demand whenever you need to. Resources can be pooled for any given application or service, so if you do have something that is maybe a little underutilized, you can pool all available resources together and try to maybe configure your applications or services to use them a little more effectively, so that we can spread workloads across pooled resources. It will entirely integrate with your existing network infrastructure, so your end users don't really have to worry about creating any kind of complex connections to gain access to something that is in the cloud. You can integrate it in a variety of ways. And the other key component is that it is a metered service. In other words, you only pay for what you use. If you create a virtual machine or an application or a service and it is not used very much, well, you will only pay for what is used. It meters everything, and your monthly bill is based on usage. So you don't end up spending too much on something that isn't being used. Now, as for the fundamental cloud services, they're categorized as these three that you can see right here. This is software as a service, this is platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service. Now, software as a service, an example of that would be something like Office 365. It is pre-configured, pre-created applications, software that most users are generally familiar with, that's already available and simply ready for them to use whenever they need to. PaaS, or platform as a service, would probably be something to host an application. Maybe a SQL database, for example, and some kind of a web-based front end. The two of them together provide a platform to host an application, so that's PaaS. And the last one, IaaS, infrastructure. Your virtual machines would be an example of that. If I need to have an additional server to host any given application or database or anything along those lines, you just go ahead and create that virtual machine, and that supplies you with your infrastructure. From that point, of course, your clients access all of those, or any or all of those, just like they would any other application, any other platform, any other server. Now, the applications that you implement as part of your cloud-based solution typically do have some considerations, but a lot of benefits as well. A variety of clients are supported, and really as long as the client itself supports a browser in most cases, they'll probably be able to access the application, whatever it is. It certainly doesn't have to be web-based, but they do support a variety of clients. There's variable and or high performance requirements that absolutely can be met. You know, again, it's based on usage. So if you need more computing power, more virtual machines, you absolutely can add them. It's entirely up to you. But again, given the fact that it is metered, if the performance requirement is not all that maybe highly in demand at any particular point in time, well, you know, you don't pay for it. You only pay for what you use. You can also synchronize data across devices because you can access a cloud-based application from anywhere, from any device. You can also make sure that the data is being synchronized across those devices. If it's maybe, let's say a user who is online for a particular amount of time, but then offline for a particular amount of time, and then they access it from a different device, they can ensure that the data is synchronized so that they're always seeing the same information. Now, there are some considerations for any kind of cloud app, and scalability certainly is one of them. How much does it need to grow? And again, because it's all usage-based, you can certainly add in as many additional servers or anything along those lines to support that application. Again, you pay for what you use, so it's very scalable. You do have to consider, however, connectivity from a client perspective. They may, of course, be somewhere where they cannot gain access to the internet itself, in which case then they're certainly not going to be able to access that application. Availability along the same lines, but as part of your subscription, you can require certain service level agreements, and you can specify what kind of availability is required as part of this solution. And also, of course, security. You do need to make sure that any application that is being accessed over the internet is secured for both the data and the identity and the application itself. All of that needs to be secured. So certainly some considerations, but that's the basics of a cloud computing type of environment. Once we start getting into actually configuring all of this, of course, we will see these in action. But for the time being, we just want to make sure that we're comfortable and familiar with the type of services and applications and how they're implemented in a cloud type of solution. So now that we have a bit of an idea as to some of the basic fundamentals of cloud computing, in this presentation we'll look a little more closely at Microsoft Azure and what it's all about. And of course, this is Microsoft's subscription-based cloud service. And this provides you with your hosts on a platform as a service and infrastructure as a service, virtual infrastructure. So we can create the virtual machines, create the necessary platforms such as a relational database or a web server, which allows us to then create and run cloud-based applications. And we can integrate any cloud-based applications along with our on-premise services as well. So we don't have to choose just one or the other. We absolutely can have our on-premise environment and then integrate the cloud-based solutions along with that so we can use both. Now, you do also have a free 1-month trial subscription available for Microsoft Azure so that you can have a look. Basically, get in there, start creating some applications or virtual machines, see if it suits your needs, and determine for yourself whether or not this is something that will be useful in your environment. And anybody can sign up for that trial. Now, infrastructure as a service, starting, if you will, at the bottom level, allows you to create your virtual servers for the necessary computing resources. And do take note that they don't offer just Windows virtual machines. You can also create Linux-based machines as you see fit. From that point, you can also choose SQL Server or SharePoint Server if any given solution you want to implement requires either of those services. Now, the platform as a service moves up a level, if you will, to support your applications. And this abstracts away a layer, if you will, to provide the following services. SQL Azure is similar, of course, to what we just saw. We can create a virtual machine that has SQL Server on it to create databases. But with that, you still have to maintain the virtual machine itself and the software, just like any server in your on-premise environment. You need to make sure that updates are applied, for example, and basic maintenance and configuration of both the server and the database. If you go with just SQL Azure, it removes the requirement to have a virtual machine. The database is there and constructed for you, but that's all you have to maintain is just the database. So it removes the requirement to maintain a virtual machine. Azure App Fabric is similar in that it provides for you a suite of middleware services and technologies that help you develop and manage any given service or application. It's typically defined with components such as what's known as service bus, access control, caching, integration, composite applications, all of which we will discuss as we move through the course. But they're basically things that as a developer you might want as part of your application, but you just don't want to bother constructing or configuring them yourself when dealing with this cloud type of solution. So App Fabric provides these for you. So it's basically, it's not unlike having predefined libraries. You can take advantage of these components that are already created for you. And Marketplace, the last option, is where you can go and browse and search for existing applications that have already been developed that you can implement, again, as part of your solution. They're all just subscription-based, but you don't have to develop anything if you want an application from the Marketplace. You just add it into your subscription, and it immediately becomes available for you to use. On-premise integration is also a configurable option. You can integrate virtual networks with your existing network. You can enhance and or augment your Active Directory environment with cloud type of solutions in a couple of different ways. And you can implement, again, things like SQL Server. And again, there's two main approaches. You can just add in another virtual machine, make it accessible, and you can install Active Directory on it or SQL, just like any other server. Or you can implement Azure's own Active Directory. It is a separate instance of Active Directory, but you can integrate your users with this additional instance, so it becomes very accessible. And again, things like SQL we just discussed, you can have a virtual machine with SQL installed, perfectly fine, or maybe you can choose to just go with a SQL database and not have the virtual machine, but that's up to you. In either case, virtual networks, Active Directory, and SQL can all integrate with your existing on-premise solutions. So you don't have to keep the two completely separate from each other. However you want to integrate them is up to you, but you absolutely can. And again, we will see all of this as we start moving through the demonstrations and configurations once we get to that part of the course. Looking at some of the physical infrastructure for Azure itself, at the time of this recording, there are 17 globally distributed data center locations, and there are at least 2 data centers per geographical area. Now, with respect to the geographical area itself, it depends on the population and the requirements generally to support any given area. And you'll typically find more data centers, obviously, in busier areas, and they'll be a little more specific as well. For example, in the United States, you'll see things like Eastern U.S. and Northwestern U.S., things like that. Whereas maybe in some of the less populated areas, you might just find based on the entire continent. So, I mean, you can check on the Azure website as to which location might be closest to you. But again, it has grown. I think even in the last year, it might have even doubled. But a lot of data centers available. And with respect to any given service or infrastructure resource that you create, you can choose to implement redundancy at the data center level. Now, local redundancy means that whatever it is that you configure is replicated to separate physical servers, but in the same data center. Geo-redundant replicates them to a completely separate data center, in essence creating the equivalent of a hot site, if you will, so that if the entire data center becomes unavailable for some reason, you have everything replicated to another data center somewhere else. As for the components themselves, it's a very modular architecture. It's just your standard racks upon racks of servers and storage that are available. So it's very scalable. And all of the physical servers themselves run on Windows Server 2012. Now, you can create any kind of virtual machine that is available within there. You are absolutely not limited to 2012 with the virtual machines, but all the physical systems run Windows Server 2012. And they take advantage of what's known as the Azure Fabric Controller, which, for all intents and purposes, is the kernel of Azure. It manages all the physical resources, accepts all the requests from the virtual machines, provides the monitoring, provides the scaling, provides the balancing, really managing the overall infrastructure environment at the physical server level. So again, it's basically the operating system itself for the overall Azure environment. Now, for organizations that are concerned with environmental issues, the data centers themselves are carbon neutral and have power and water efficiency levels that are adequate for you to address these concerns, particularly if you are supplying services to someone else and they are concerned with that issue as well. So again, for more details, just check the Microsoft Azure website. There's a lot of documentation about the environmental concerns, but they do offer them, and you can rest assured that whatever environmental issues need to be addressed certainly can be, again, for those organizations that do have to deal with environmental issues. Let's take a look now at all of the services that are available to you as part of your Azure subscription, and we'll just overview them for the time being. We will absolutely see each of these in much greater detail as we move through the course. But for starters, web services. This, of course, allows you to create and deploy very scalable and high-performance websites literally in minutes. You don't have to wait for 24 or 48 hours in most cases for DNS propagation and things like that. In most cases, you literally can have a live website within minutes. Your mobile services provides all of the back-end necessary for hosting any kind of a mobile app that you might want to develop. Compute services includes things like virtual machines, various cloud services which might encompass any number of components to host a complete application, large-scale batch compute jobs, remote applications, things along those lines. Networking services includes virtual networks, ExpressRoute, which is in essence a dedicated private network connection to the cloud, and Traffic Manager, which allows you to implement load balancing for performance and availability. Data services, things like SQL relational databases, or maybe the non-relational ones such as NoSQL and StoreSimple. Analytics, which includes things like HD Insight and Hadoop. Machine learning, stream analytics, event hubs. And continuing on, backup services, of course, you can integrate your cloud-based backup along with on-premise solutions that you might have, so you can effectively treat the cloud as a backup target. Storage, very durable, highly available, massively scalable cloud storage is available. Content and media to encode, store, and stream multimedia content. Configure content delivery networks for users to access the closest data center for accessing that content. Identity and access management, things like Azure Active Directory and multi-factor authentication to extend your directory services. Hybrid integration features like BizTalk services, Service Bus, site recovery, things along those lines. And then the ability to group and or co-locate the resources that you might implement. Now, these are all different types of configurations that you can use to improve the performance by keeping the services and or resources physically close together and or close to your end users, of course. So the region is always something that you choose. Whenever you specify any kind of resource, it asks you which region you want to define this resource in. And that, of course, should generally be something that is close to your users. So this keeps all of the components within the same region. Now, you can get quite specific by implementing affinity groups, and this narrows the focus down, in most cases, right to the same rack. So if I want a virtual machine and storage account and a website that goes along with it and a database and all of that, it tries to tie all of that to a specific set of hardware resources. So as mentioned, in most cases, usually right down to the same rack. Now, at the time of this recording, affinity groups are, I don't want to say not being used anymore by any means, but maybe not quite as favored, because a little while ago what happened was Azure underwent a fairly significant hardware upgrade, and creating an affinity group by tying it to a specific set of hardware resources meant that the new upgraded hardware was not accessible to the affinity group. So I think the preferred choice these days is now what's known as the resource group, which allows the resources of any component or service that you might configure to extend beyond the limits of an affinity group so that new and upgraded hardware is accessible. So you might find a little bit of confusion in some cases if you're doing some searching about affinity groups versus resource groups, but I believe that's the primary difference, where affinity groups were tied to a specific set of hardware resources. They were not able to access those upgraded hardware resources. So resource groups do allow extending beyond the limits of what an affinity group used to have. But in either case, any one of those grouping or co-locating options is simply designed to enhance performance by keeping everything close together. So that's really up to you to decide with respect to what kind of performance you require, but this does allow you to keep them close so that we do benefit from low latency and obviously simply having the hardware physically close together. The resources that you might implement. Now, these are all different types of configurations that you can use to improve the performance by keeping the services and or resources physically close together and or close to your end users, of course. So the region is always something that you choose. Whenever you specify any kind of resource, it asks you which region you want to define this resource in. And that, of course, should generally be something that is close to your users. So this keeps all of the components within the same region. Now, you can get quite specific by implementing affinity groups, and this narrows the focus down, in most cases, right to the same rack. So if I want a virtual machine and storage account and a website that goes along with it and a database and all of that, it tries to tie all of that to a specific set of hardware resources. So as mentioned, in most cases, usually right down to the same rack. Now, at the time of this recording, affinity groups are, I don't want to say not being used anymore by any means, but maybe not quite as favored, because a little while ago what happened was Azure underwent a fairly significant hardware upgrade, and creating an affinity group by tying it to a specific set of hardware resources meant that the new upgraded hardware was not accessible to the affinity group. So I think the preferred choice these days is now what's known as the resource group, which allows the resources of any component or service that you might configure to extend beyond the limits of an affinity group so that new and upgraded hardware is accessible. So you might find a little bit of confusion in some cases if you're doing some searching about affinity groups versus resource groups, but I believe that's the primary difference, where affinity groups were tied to a specific set of hardware resources. They were not able to access those upgraded hardware resources. So resource groups do allow extending beyond the limits of what an affinity group used to have. But in either case, any one of those grouping or co-locating options is simply designed to enhance performance by keeping everything close together. So that's really up to you to decide with respect to what kind of performance you require. But this does allow you to keep them close so that we do benefit from low latency and obviously simply having the hardware physically close together. So now that we've had a little bit of an introduction to some cloud computing concepts and a little bit about Microsoft Azure itself, in this demonstration we're just going to get into the subscription and take a look at the management interface known as the Azure portal. Now, the first thing about the demonstrations with respect to this course, we will be using the free trial account, so you can go and set that up for yourself as well. And let's just open up a new tab here, and the address you can go to is azure.microsoft.com. And that will bring you to their homepage, and there you see is the link for the free trial. Now, you will need to supply some credit card information for this, and obviously some personal contact information, but you can use any Microsoft email account, so anything under Hotmail or Outlook.com, for example. Any address is sufficient in that regard, and nothing will get charged to your card. It is free. But what happens when you do sign up, and you can see again that I've already done that, you get a credit status here, which shows you how many days are remaining or how much money is left. So they give you a credit. So it's essentially whichever one of these runs out first, which will determine the length of your subscription. So the credit, of course, is simulated, I guess, if you will, but it does match up to how much you'll be drawing from it, if you will, in terms of the services that you configure. So if there is a lot of activity happening in your Azure trial environment, chances are you'll run out of the credit before you'll run out of the 29 days. So 30 days is just that the first day is being counted here. So anyway, that basically will give you an idea as to where you stand, but you absolutely can create another one if you need to, but it would have to be under a different account. So when you first hit the portal there, when you do access your free trial, you can click right here on Portal, and that will ask you to simply sign in, and it will bring you into this page right here. So the first thing that you might want to do is just verify your account credentials. You see there's options there about viewing your bill, but there is a link here that we're going to see in the next demonstration, but I just wanted to point it out. You see there's this preview of a new portal. Now, new obviously being a relative term, but at the time of this recording, this is the new portal that's available, but it is still in preview mode. And you'll actually see this quite a few times for certain features within Azure. You might see that a particular feature is still in preview mode, which means that it is functional, but maybe not all components of the feature have been released yet. So again, we'll see that in the next demonstration, but I did just want to point out the whole concept of the preview mode. So with respect to actually creating and getting started with building things in your Azure environment, your service panel is this section over here on the left. So these are all of the Azure services, and all items you can see here will show you everything that has been created. Now you will see this option right here in every subscription that you create. This default directory is simply meant to contain the accounts that are part of your Azure subscription. And of course, the only one that's going to be in here is your own account. So in fact, you can see that if you scroll all the way to the bottom of the services and click on Settings, This gives you the information here about your subscription, but most notably, right here, you see there's your administrator account, which is whichever one you used to create the subscription. And again, it's stored in this default directory here. So you can absolutely just leave that as it is, but if you do want somebody else to be able to have administrative access as part of this subscription, you certainly can do that, because you see there's an administrators tab right here wherein you can add another account to this subscription at an administrative level, so they can maybe get in and browse around and see what it's like as well. So you do always want to make sure that your own account is listed as an administrator, and then it's up to you if you want to add another account in under the same subscription. Now, as for the other services, you can see there's quite a few here: websites, virtual machines, mobile services, cloud services, databases, storage, and so on and so on. So obviously these are the things that we will be going through as we hit each of the demonstrations. And you see there's quite a lot of them. So when you select any particular service, such as virtual machines, it will tell you you don't have any virtual machines yet. To get started, click Create Virtual Machine, and you can do that for any kind of service here. So no matter what you select over here, it will tell you what you currently have, or give you an option to create one right there. Or you can also just click on the New button down here on your notifications bar at any time, regardless of where you are in the Services pane. If you just click New, it gives you all of the categories here, so you can just go through them from that point, and each category that you choose gives you the options right over there, so you can create them from here as well. Now, again, obviously, these are the things that we will be doing throughout the demonstrations. So for the time being, we just wanted to get you into the portal environment, have a quick look around, verify your credit status and your account status, and the administrator account in particular. But one final thing, you will always find a help section right down here, the little question mark. So if you just click on help, you see that there's quite a lot of content here, and it's sensitive to wherever you are in your services pane. So you see here it's all help about virtual machines. So if I close that and then maybe switch to websites and then click help again, you can see, whoops, there we go. Just took a second to refresh, but now it's help on managing websites. So the help section is always content sensitive. So anywhere that you happen to be, just click on the help button, and there's quite a few links here that you can just simply click on and browse through. In a lot of cases, there's tutorials there as well, which will help you to get started and give you a better idea as to what any particular feature is about. Now, they may not all have tutorials, but quite a few of them do. So again, just select your section, hit the help, and just have a look to see what's in there. And if there are any tutorials, then by all means feel free to browse those as well. In some cases, they are actual videos where they will walk you through the process. In some cases, they're just presentations that explain concepts, but they're typically pretty useful in terms of navigating around and getting familiar with the Azure Management Portal. Okay, so we've seen a basic overview of the management portal for Azure, but as mentioned in the previous demonstration, there is also now a new portal available. So let's take a look at that, and we can access it by just clicking our account name, choose Switch to New Portal, and it will launch this in its own separate tab. So our original portal does stay open. It won't sign us out or close this or anything. And here we have it. Now, quick word, as of the time of this recording, you can see that it is still in preview mode, which basically means that it's not yet fully functional. It doesn't mean that you can't use it. By all means, if you feel that this might be a more comfortable environment for you, then absolutely go ahead and use it. But while it is in preview mode, just means that some features might not yet be available. So, just in terms of getting around here, for starters, you can see that there is the Azure portal link right here, which in fact will take us back to the original one if you started from here. But again, since it launched it in a new tab, there's our original one anyway, so that's not a big deal, but that's how you can switch back and forth pretty quickly and easily. Now, the interface itself looks very familiar to the Metro interface for Windows 8 or Windows Server 2012. So you have your tiles here that can be sized, repositioned, anything along those lines, and of course removed from what's known as the start board if desired. So you can right-click any tile, and you see that you've got some right-click functionality in here. So you can just unpin from the start board. Or if you right-click out here in some available space, you can customize the entire start board just by reordering and resizing. But of course, you can add new tiles to the start board as well. So for an example of that, let's just go to the Browse option here. And let's say if we want just a shortcut to all of our SQL databases, you can just click on anything in the Browse option here, and it will just filter out. So there, of course, is the list of all the ones that you would have, which, of course, we don't have yet, but that's fine. But right here, if you click on the ellipsis, I can pin this to the start board. So that just gives me a nice quick link to my SQL databases. So if I click Home now, you see there are my SQL databases. So you can just browse for all of the things that you would commonly access and then pin them to your start board. Now, it also gives me a notification here, which just tells me that this is what occurred. So it does maintain a history of changes that are made to the environment, and that will record just about everything. If I could click on the history here, obviously pinning to the start board is nothing critical, but any changes to a virtual machine, anything that was newly created, really any change will be recorded in the notifications, and you can be able to see that. Now, it does, however, clear out each time you sign out, so it's only for this session. But at least you can go back and see what changes were made during any kind of a session. There's some nice features in here for sure as well. Obviously, the billing status is right there, so it tells you right away where you are. There's your portal settings that we saw in the previous demonstration, so same kind of options are available there. But this is a nice feature right here. The service health of Azure for all of the different data centers. So if we click on this, you can scroll through and it'll tell you in real time if there are any issues with a particular service. So obviously we want to see green check marks, but if anything should go down, it will actually report that in here. And you can break this down by the locations as well. So again, let's just go to maybe SQL database. You can then choose the region that's closest to you or where you know you have SQL database services, and you can find out the status in that particular region. So you can always add this to your start board as well if you want to. Each of these columns that pops up here, you see, is referred to as a blade. So if you click on the pin, you see the option there is to pin the blade to the start board. So if I just go ahead and pin that, I can close each of these blades down. And there you see is the status of that service in my particular region. So again, you can customize this however you see fit. When it comes to creating new services or new configurations of any description, there's the new option right there. And it's categorized a little bit differently than the original portal, but you can see there's the options for computing, web and mobile, data and storage, so on and so on. Again, just pick whichever category you want. And anything that you need to create is available there from your shortcuts here, and it's all the same options. It just presents it a little bit differently. But when you are creating something like a VM in this case, you see you also have the option to add this to your start board. So you can just have a quick shortcut straight to this particular virtual machine or anything else, again, that you feel is going to be appropriate. So, as mentioned, at this point, it really is a matter of preference. But again, since it is still in preview mode, we'll be doing pretty much all of our demonstrations from the original portal. But if you prefer to operate in the new portal, by all means, feel free to do so. Again, you just might encounter a particular functionality here or there that isn't quite available yet because of that preview. mode. But at some point, they will certainly decommission the original management portal here. So, getting comfortable and familiar with the new one obviously isn't going to hurt anything, but we'll be doing our demonstrations again from the original one. Okay, so now we have seen both the original and the new management portal for your Azure subscription. But these days, a lot of environments are using things like PowerShell to perform their administrative tasks. And in fact, PowerShell can be extended to connect into your Azure subscription. So we're going to see how to get started with enabling PowerShell to access the Azure subscription. But the first thing you need to do is install all of the necessary modules. Now, for those of you who are familiar with PowerShell, you know that you can just do something like an import module command, for example, for Active Directory commands. But what you need to do in this case is to actually download the appropriate utility. So let's just open up a new browser page here. And what you need to do is go to the downloads page, which is azure.microsoft.com/downloads. And from there, you'll find all kinds of SDKs for the development environment of your choice. But if you scroll down, you'll see the command line tools, and there, in fact, is the option for Windows PowerShell. So what you want to do is simply click on the install link right here, and then just run this installer. Of course, you can save it and run it later. Now, I've already installed it, but all you have to do is click run. It's a web-based installer. It takes about 2 minutes, if that. So go ahead and install that. And once it is installed, all of your modules for Azure will be available in your PowerShell environment. So I'm just going to cancel out of here and close this. But let's just launch our PowerShell. And I'm going to go with the ISE, but you do want to make sure that you run it as an administrator. So now that they have been installed, you can see under the commands here, well, they're already right there, but if we just hit our drop down here, there's the category of Azure has become available now, and you can see there are all of the options that are specific to managing your Azure environment, and you can see clearly there are quite a few of them. So obviously it will take some time to get familiar with each of these. There's obviously a significant number of commandlets that are available, but you can double click any one of them. Let's just go to maybe the add category, for example. Under the Add Azure Account, if you double click, you see that there are commandlets that are required for this. So I can click on the Show Details, and it's just basically going to give me the necessary arguments and parameters to complete this command. So there's the user information, the service principal information here, and some of them, of course, with the asterisks are meaning that they are required. Now, we're gonna see how to do this in an upcoming demonstration to manage the account information. But again, if we just refresh this and go back, every commandlet that you might want to run, all you have to do is just double click on it, and it provides you with the necessary parameters and, of course, the optional ones as well. So you can just fill them in here. That will generate the script for you, and then you can simply execute that command as needed. So, again, if you're a capable scripter, you can do an awful lot of things with your PowerShell environment, just like any other environment. Create these reusable scripts that can be run at any time, and basically manage Azure as if it was just part of your local environment. Add in your virtual machines, add in your roles, add in your services, your databases. All of that can be done through your environment here. And again, you can just create your scripts, save them, make them reusable, just maybe alter a parameter or two if necessary, and of course manage your environment entirely through the PowerShell. Now, this is obviously optional. You don't need to use PowerShell. If you prefer to do everything in the Azure online interfaces, that's perfectly fine. So it really is up to you. But in our upcoming demonstrations, we'll see a couple examples of how to set this up, because obviously we need to connect our local instance of PowerShell through to the subscription. So we need to sign in, basically. But we'll see that shortly. But for the time being, again, we just wanted to see how you install all the necessary modules for PowerShell and how to browse around and find them and see some of the details for each one of them. And of course, you can always use your get help. So maybe just before we get out of here, for example, adding a new image. Let's just see the help for that. We can get help or add Azure. Well, it doesn't matter. Anything here. Add Azure disk. So we can just put that in, and of course we can do examples or full or anything along those lines. But there, of course, is the help for those commands, and it tells you, of course, a little more information about it. So don't hesitate to use your help system to gain access to more information about each of these commands. Now that we have our Azure module installed into PowerShell, we are ready to go ahead and start performing administrative tasks. But the first thing we have to do is some account management to set up authentication, basically. In short, signing into our Azure account from PowerShell. And there's two different ways that you can do this. One is by using a file that you can download, and the other is just by specifying the account name. So we'll actually see both. So the first approach, again, was getting that file. And the commandlet for this is get Azure publish settings file is the name of it. So there you see autocomplete helping us out. So we can just double click on that and just hit enter. Now this will take you to a subscription download page. Now the reason it didn't prompt us to sign in, I'm already signed in. So if you were not signed in, it would simply prompt you to do so. But what happens with this is it basically takes your subscription information, packages it up into a file that you see right here. You want to open or save it. So we want to save it. You can call it whatever you want. You can save it wherever you want. But I've already done this, and I just stripped off the free trial and date information here, simply called it credentials.publish settings, and saved it to a folder on my C drive. So I'm just going to cancel this. Close out of here, and we can just minimize. And here is my file right there, again, just on the C drive, Azure, there's the file. So this contains all the necessary information to authenticate my local PowerShell instance to this subscription. So we just need to import this file into this PowerShell session. So in this case, it is import Azure publish settings file. And we simply need to specify the location of the file, which is C:\Azure / name of file. That's all we have to specify. Hit enter, and there you go. We have effectively been signed in from PowerShell, and I can start doing my management now. Now we can verify what has been entered with the get Azure account commandlet. And this will show us an ID, and you see it says that it's based on the certificate that we just downloaded. So that's simply how we have authenticated to that particular subscription. Now, if you want to remove this, you certainly can. This is remove. In this case, it's Azure subscription. Just type in a few more characters. So remove Azure subscription in this case is the name of it, not remove the publish settings file. We can keep the file. So if we just remove the subscription, you can double click on that, and there you see is the subscription information here, which was also given to us right here. Now, obviously we need to specify one of these arguments to tell it which subscription to remove. So if you just hit the dash here for the parameters, see, there are the valid arguments, either the subscription name or the ID. Either one can be passed in. Personally, I like the ID simply because it does not have a space in the name in this case. Yours may not if it's a quote real account, but it doesn't matter. You could pass in either. So I'm just going to copy this, and I'm just going to use the subscription ID argument and pass in that ID by pasting it in. Enter. Are you sure? Yes. There. That has removed it. So if you run the get command again, it should show nothing. And there we go. So that's the first option, using the import settings file. So let's clear our screen here. And let's see the other option, which is just to add in the Azure account. So we can just type in add Azure account. And again, all you have to do is hit enter, and it will prompt you for the credentials that you use to sign in. So our trial is using this account name here. And we can just click on continue, and it will redirect us. And in essence, this is signing in on behalf of PowerShell, if you will. So we just have to supply our password. And that does the same thing. We will be authenticated here, so you can see there is the same user information that I just used to log in with. So again, if I do my get Azure account information, there's the same information there. It's just redundant here, but does verify that we have been authenticated. So now if we want to sign out from here, it's remove Azure account. And again, we can just hit enter. You could specify the name here, but it's, for whatever reason, it's a little bit off here, if you will. You can see under the table, it's calling it ID. But if we just type in remove Azure account, or actually, let's do this. If I hit my dash here, you see it does not have an argument for ID. It only has name. So I'm not entirely sure why that is, but you don't even have to worry about that, because you can just say remove Azure account and hit enter, and it'll prompt you and see it's asking for the name. So interestingly enough, it wants this name right here. So again, we can just copy that, and we can just paste it in here. Hit enter, and that will remove this as well. And again, if we, for one last time, run our get, there you can see nothing is there. So that's how you can do your basic authentication of your accounts from PowerShell up into your Azure subscription and perform your management. And we'll do a few tasks in our next demonstration. Now that we have our authentication set up for PowerShell, let's take a look to see how we can do a few basic commands from the PowerShell environment. Now let's just double check here. We're going to do a get Azure account just to make sure we're still logged in, and we are. So with respect to performing any given command against your Azure environment, as mentioned previously, there's obviously an awful lot of commands, and you might find it simpler to just use the management interface. But if you are looking to to get familiar with the PowerShell methods, then one of the ways I recommend is to actually go to your commands here, hit your drop down, choose Azure as your category, and then of course scroll through your available options, and again you can just double click on any one of them and it will tell you what it expects. Now, as far as the difference, I guess, between the add options and the new options, typically adding involves things that are already defined in the Azure environment. So that, for example, you might add a virtual disk to an existing virtual machine, things along those lines. If you are creating something from scratch, then in those cases, it's usually the new commandlets. So I'm just going to scroll through here quickly till we get to the new options. And again, you can get it, a quick idea here as to how many there are. So here we are in the news. So let's just do a quick example of creating a new database server, for example. So if I scroll through here, you see everything is new Azure something. So if we just scroll a couple more here, there we see new Azure SQL database and new database server. So, again, you can just double click on any one of these and you see here are the parameters that it expects for that particular command. So this one, I've chosen this one just because it's fairly simple. So if you just double click again, your parameters will come up here. So it wants to know the name of an administrator login. Now, if you haven't ever done this before, there are a few restrictions. So again, I do recommend, if you're just getting started, maybe go to your interface here and try it out here, because there are some restrictions on things like the usernames and passwords that you need to be aware of. But For our purposes here, we'll just go ahead and create this. So you can see currently I have no SQL database servers. And let's just refresh this to make sure of that. Okay, so no SQL database servers. So we'll go back into our PowerShell environment here, and what it wants to know for this server is the name of a login that's going to be the administrator account. Now, just one of the restrictions I referred to earlier, you can't call it administrator. So what I'm going to do is call it admin1, and then you have to give it a password here, and the password has to have an uppercase letter and some numbers. From that point, you have to specify the location, and again, that is really, whatever is closest to you or wherever you need to put it. So in this case, closest to me is Eastern US region, and those are the arguments. So I can just click on Insert now, and you see there is the actual syntax for that command. So if I was looking to create some scripts or something that was reusable, I of course could just copy this, paste it into a text file, and save it as a PowerShell script. So you see the syntax here. The only thing that required quotations was the location because, of course, the space in the name. But that should be ready to go. And again, because we've already signed in, I'm pretty much ready to run this. So let's just hit enter. So it should only take a second or two, and we should see that a new database server will be created. So there it is. There's the name. Now, you don't have any control over the name. They're pretty much system-generated, fairly randomized characters, but that has now been created with all of those credentials. So if we go back into our management interface here and do another refresh, we should see that that server has been created. Now, obviously, something as simple as that, you probably could do it a little more quickly in the graphic interface here, but the whole idea, again, is just to see how you can perform the same tasks that you can do in the management interface through PowerShell. So, again, just double-click on whatever command it is that you want, specify the parameters that it requires, and if you're not sure as to what those parameters are, again, you can always use the get help to see an example. So, maybe if I wasn't sure what this would look like, we could go in and just do a get help on that command. Whoops, not get. New Azure SQL database server. And then if you add in the full or the examples argument, it gives you all the details. And here again you see is an actual example right there, which is almost identical to what we specified, except of course the credentials that we supplied. But there you see the location is East US in quotes. But the other values, because there are no spaces, don't actually have quotes around them. So again, compare that to what was actually run. In my commandlet here, it did not put quotes around the login or the password. So let's just reinsert this. You can see again, there are no quotes for anything that does not require any spaces. So that's how you can perform those tasks through your PowerShell environment, and it creates them directly in your subscription. And of course, always remember to log in through PowerShell to your subscription before you attempt to run any scripts. Using virtual networks in Microsoft Azure allows you to create and configure sets of virtual machines and place them into a network configuration that either isolates them from other virtual machines that you might have in the cloud or enables them to connect locally to your existing on-premise environment. So it is still just a network that's created in the cloud, but it effectively extends your on-premises networks. This way, services that are on-premise can access the cloud as if those virtual machines were local, and vice versa. The cloud services can access the on-premises servers as if they were local. So it really does just extend your existing environment with respect to the network configuration and the virtual machines that they're able to access. Now, you can do things like exporting and importing private network configuration because Azure IP ranges are the same local private ranges that most organizations tend to use. The 10 addresses, the 172.16, and of course the 192.168 are all used within the Azure environment. So the networks can be created to fit your existing ranges for full integration. And what you can do then is to export or import this configuration, which means that you can create them on a test account before moving it into production. So if you have multiple subscriptions in your organization, you can configure the virtual network using any kind of test account, and you can export that to a file. Then you can send it to someone else who maybe has the production account, and they can import the configuration into production. VPN access is also an option when making your connections, and you can connect cross-premises with a site-to-site VPN, and this uses usually some kind of hardware-based appliance, like you might set up to a branch office. You can do the same thing and effectively treat the cloud like a branch office. Optionally, you can also secure a connection with a point-to-site VPN, wherein you're just setting it up using a client on a particular system. But this allows you to implement things like certificates for security, so that, of course, all of the traffic is secured across that VPN. But in either way, you can simply make the cloud environment accessible, again, as if it was just an extension of your existing network configuration through VPN configurations. Now, if you are going to set up virtual networks, then you do still need to be able to resolve the names, but you can customize your DNS however you need to support whatever services and names need to be resolved. So you can create a custom DNS name for the Azure environment, and then within that, of course, you're able to resolve names for any kind of web services, any websites that you might configure, as well as storage accounts and blob data. All can be resolved once you integrate your DNS solution to include Azure. Now, you have two choices here as well. You can implement DNS name resolution within your own DNS hierarchy or organization, however you have it configured. You can also use Azure DNS, and you can integrate that as well. Ultimately, it's just which servers are performing the name resolution, but you can either do it or you can allow Azure to do it for you. So whatever you feel is more appropriate there, but certainly you're going to want to be able to implement name resolution so that we don't have to always, of course, rely on just IP addresses. But DNS absolutely can be integrated along with all of the other network configuration options when you're using virtual networks. Looking now at some of the virtual network features that are available if you decide to implement a virtual network. And again, we'll just overview them for now and certainly see them in much greater detail a little bit later. But one of the main components is what's known as cloud services. Now, this is a bit of a vague term, but in its simplest definition, cloud services allows you to abstract the virtual machines that are required to run any kind of application from the application itself. So anytime you need to develop any kind of application, of course, there needs to be virtual machines to host it. But encompassing them within a cloud service, as mentioned, kind of abstracts the machines from the application. So we'll talk about that in much greater detail later on. But for the time being, any virtual machine, for example, or any resource that is in the same cloud service is automatically able to see any other resource in the same cloud service. So it's also a bit of a way of grouping resources together as well. The VNet is pretty much exactly as it sounds, the virtual network. So it allows you to define, of course, what is the address range of the virtual network and which systems are included within that particular network. The virtual machines obviously are then placed into the VNet, however you determine they should be placed. And affinity groups we discussed previously, and this attempts to keep all of the hardware resources tied together, if you will, and in most cases right down to the same rack of hardware. And that all of this configuration can be accessed through an endpoint rather than having to set up a VPN. So we can just access all of the configuration through a single endpoint. As far as the IP address features go, you absolutely can supply virtual IP addresses so that an entire cloud service, for example, can be configured with a single IP, or perhaps a cluster can be configured with virtual IP address. You can implement reserved IP addresses if you want to, just the same way that you would in your own on-premise environment. You can also now incorporate instance-level public addresses, and this is relatively new for Azure. Previously, it only supported private address ranges, but you can actually now incorporate some public addresses into a virtual network. And of course, as far as the configuration goes, you can implement either static or dynamic IP address allocation, whatever you feel is more appropriate there as well. And as far as traffic management goes, you've got a couple of choices here in terms of balancing the load. There is an Azure load balancer, or you can implement your own internal load balancer, depending on how you've configured the software, of course, on any virtual machines. But in either case, you want to make sure that the load of traffic is simply balanced and equally distributed, as best as possible. There is also the Azure Traffic Manager, which typically operates on a little higher level, usually across multiple regions. If you have users that are quite geographically dispersed, you want to make sure that the traffic is always routed correctly, if you will, to the closest resource that's available to them. And a couple of other features. DNS, of course, can be fully integrated into any virtual network that you might configure for name resolution, and they're all accessible through VPN if you want that ability. So a lot of features, and as mentioned, we'll certainly see how this is all configured and set up once we get into our demonstrations. But virtual networks, of course, just allow you to determine which virtual machines, which services, which applications are placed into the appropriate network configuration. Regional virtual networks is a relatively new feature within Azure that can overcome some of the limitations to earlier configurations. And we touched on this previously. VNets in earlier implementations had to be bound to an affinity group. And affinity groups, we mentioned earlier, are a way to increase performance by ensuring that all of the necessary resources for any particular configuration were all contained within the same collection of hardware, usually right down to the same rack. So if you defined a virtual network previously, you actually had to bind it to an affinity group, which certainly made it somewhat limited. So now, as the name suggests, a regional virtual network can span a region. So certainly a much broader range than being tied to a specific set of hardware, as in the affinity group. So some features that you get with this then are reserved IP addresses. So within the virtual network, you can absolutely reserve any kind of IP address. Instance-level public IP addresses, which again were not supported earlier, but public addresses can now be implemented into your virtual network configuration. And internal load balancing can be configured as well, because if you are spanning regions, you might want to make sure that, of course, the traffic is balanced appropriately so that one region is not getting all the traffic while another region is hardly getting any. You also no longer have the requirement to create an affinity group. So when you define the virtual network, it simply doesn't even ask you anymore to assign it to an affinity group. It's just no longer required. And pretty robust capabilities, up to 2,048 virtual machines per VNet. And again, coming back to the affinity group, one of the limitations there was, in fact, the upgrade in hardware that was implemented at Azure. and affinity groups were effectively not able to access that new and upgraded hardware. So the A8 and the A9 virtual machine sizes are just classifications. They're categories of the hardware levels that are available. And previously, they were not available to affinity groups because they were tied to already existing hardware resources. So now with the regional virtual network, you can access those higher levels of hardware. You cannot, however, convert an affinity group to a regional VNet. So if you already have the affinity group defined, there is no option to just convert that up to the regional VNet. You in essence would have to make sure that you create the VNet and quite possibly recreate any resources that might have previously been in the affinity group, or at least remove them from the affinity group before they could be assigned to a regional VNet. But you do get some nice new features, and I think I mentioned earlier, as of the time of this recording, I think it's probably the preferred way to go. I suspect that affinity groups might actually be deprecated at some point, but there's been no official word about that happening. But I do suspect that that is something that you might see as things move forward. There are a number of considerations and reasons why you might choose to implement a virtual network as part of your Azure subscription. So let's have a look at a few scenarios that might help you to determine whether or not a virtual network is suitable to your implementation. So the first is a private cloud scenario wherein you're just looking to create a private network to host the virtual machines that are up in the private cloud. Maybe you're just looking to extend your resources, but you don't have the physical hardware to do so. Well, we can create as many virtual machines as we want in the private cloud and simply access them as if they were, the same as our on-premise servers. Any traffic that is being generated between the virtual machines that are in the cloud does stay within the private cloud. Now, obviously, we might have to access them from our on-premise location, but anything that has to happen, for example, with respect to a front-end website accessing a database that are both in the cloud, all of that traffic stays in the cloud. We can configure endpoints as well to access the private cloud. So what this alleviates is the need for a VPN. So again, users don't have to worry about establishing VPN connections to get to those cloud servers. They can access them as if they were local, just like those that are on-premise. Maybe you're looking at a data center extension scenario wherein we're still just looking to add more virtual machines to a virtual network, but in this case, maybe we are looking to access those virtual machines through a site-to-site IP-secured VPN. In essence, this is the equivalent of setting up Site 2, if you will. We simply have our existing data center. We create as many virtual machines as are necessary in the cloud. We establish a site-to-site IPsec secured connection through to that other site, and in essence, you have your second site. So we can extend our data center in that kind of fashion. Maybe it's a hybrid cloud scenario wherein you're looking to connect your existing data center to the cloud data center, and then maybe have a web app that is running in the cloud access your on-premise resources. That creates basically this hybrid solution wherein there's resources being accessed from one another. And a couple of other scenarios, maybe you just already have a VNet defined and you want to connect it to another VNet, so just VNet to VNet connectivity, or any type of cross-premise connectivity, which includes these three options that you see here. A site-to-site VPN, which typically implements a hardware device on either end, or a point-to-site VPN, which allows you to actually configure a software client within your on-premise environment, still to a hardware-based appliance in the cloud, or even ExpressRoute, which is a dedicated private connection that you do have to set up through your internet service provider. But with this, you do get a dedicated connection straight to the cloud environment. So for performs significantly better than a standard internet connection. So any or all of those might be reasons why you might choose to implement a virtual network, but they certainly can enhance and extend your capabilities regardless of your current infrastructure. When designing the address space for any virtual networks that you might configure in Azure, you really can treat them as extensions of your on-premise configuration because they use the same private address spaces that most internal organizations use. They have the Class A 10 networks with an 8-bit subnet mask, the Class B 172.16 and a 16-bit mask, and of course the 192.168 Class Cs with the 24-bit mask. So these are all the exact same addresses that almost any internal organization would use in terms of defining their own network address space. So when it comes to defining the subnets for your Azure VNets, you can pretty much design them like any internal network design. The subnet size is still the number of hosts in total, minus 2, because Azure does still reserve the first address and the last address of every subnet, so those aren't available for standard host addressing. And then each space can be further subdivided if you decide to, using classless interdomain routing. So however you feel is appropriate to designate the address scheme, that's entirely up to you. You pretty much can do whatever you need to. There are a few limitations, but nothing that is too surprising. There is no support for IP version 6 in Azure Virtual Networks, and VNet subnets, of course, that you might want to configure cannot overlap the address space that you have in your on-premise environment. So you do just want to treat it like a separate subnet, a separate network that still has to be routed. So you don't want to overlap the addresses at all. But in terms of configuring them, really just treat them like an additional network that you might do internally and just use the same kind of address ranges that you're used to and comfortable with. And you shouldn't have any troubles with addressing your virtual machines within those virtual networks. Any virtual network that you might configure as part of your Azure subscription is still going to require name resolution like any other network. Now, there's a couple of different ways that you can approach this, and in the first example here, we'll look at Azure-provided name resolution. This is suitable in some cases, but not all of them, and ultimately it really comes down to where is the name resolution request coming from, which server does it have to go to, and where is the ultimate target system that is being resolved. So if we have the DNS role instance and or the virtual machines in the same cloud service, which, take note, still requires a VNet, then Azure provided name resolution will work just fine. Now we'll come back to that still requires a VNet in a moment. Similarly, if the DNS role instance and the virtual machines are in the same VNet, but not in the same cloud service, then that will still work as well. In other words, a VNet is required, but the same cloud service is not necessarily required. So in either of those cases, Azure provided name resolution will work just fine, but it still comes down to where are the clients that are requesting the name resolution. And if it's all happening within Azure, then Azure provided name resolution absolutely will work just fine. But you might have an on-premise DNS scenario wherein we're looking to create this cross-premises resolution implementation because the clients are local to your own environment and they're needing to access Azure virtual machines. So the resolution happens between Azure and your on-premise environment. So in this case, clients use their own locally configured DNS server, which then has a zone configured for the Azure environment, and it performs the name resolution for those systems like any other set of clients. So as mentioned, it just comes down to where are the clients, which server do they need to request from, and where are the ultimate target systems. Now, there's a couple of scenarios that aren't supported for name resolution. And coming back to what we discussed on the first point, if you have a virtual machine and or the DNS role instance in the same cloud service, but not in a VNet, then in fact this is not supported. So just let me back up here quickly. That's where you see in this first bullet here, it's suitable if they're in the same cloud service, but it still has to have a VNet. So in essence, setting up a VNet is step one. So here we do still see them in the same cloud service, but not in a VNet, then basically this is not supported. Similarly, if the role instance is in a different cloud service, but still not in a VNet, then this is also not supported. So what it comes down to really is that a VNet is required. Now, there are other name resolution scenarios that you might be interested in. Sometimes DNS is more so designed for traffic management because DNS is able to do things like round robin, wherein it can distribute traffic amongst multiple nodes of a cluster, for example. So maybe you're interested in doing that, and you still can. Or maybe you're just looking to do name resolution between internet and or public endpoints from within Azure, and maybe your on-premise one is only going to handle internal name resolution, and you can certainly do that as well. So, just a couple of different ways to manage your overall traffic can be achieved by using DNS. So you just need to give a little extra attention, a little extra thought into how name resolution is going to be performed between the on-premise environment and the Azure virtual networks. So we're ready now to get started with creating our Azure environment, and in this demonstration we're going to take a look at setting up a new virtual network. Now, when it comes to creating anything, you have two choices. You can scroll through your service bar here and locate the category that you want. So there is networks, and there's the option to create a new virtual network. So you can see that this pulls us into the what they refer to as the custom create, this multi-page wizard. Or you can just click on the new button and locate the appropriate category here. And this gives you a few more options. You see there's a quick create, there's the custom create, which is exactly the same as what we just saw, or you can import a configuration or do some other various options depending on what it is you're trying to create. But you do get a few more choices from here. Now, the quick create option, you do want to be a little bit aware of some of the limitations, I guess, with the quick create. And it depends on what it is that you're trying to configure. But, for example, if I go ahead and click quick create here, I can supply a name, and I can choose my address space. But look at the maximum VM count for the subnet size. I only get 5 options here. So this is what I was referring to, that in some cases the quick create might actually be a little bit limiting, but you can usually reconfigure it after the fact if necessary. So I'm not trying to suggest that you shouldn't use the quick create, but if you want a little more flexibility at creation time, you might want to go the custom create option. So again, the custom create, in fact, is the same as doing this method right here. So let's have a look at that one. All we have to do, of course, is give it a name. So let's call this VNet1. Choose the location and click on Next. Now, the DNS servers and VPN connectivity, none of these are required. We won't bother configuring anything with respect to VPNs at this point. But the DNS servers, you do see we could enter them in here. And if you're not certain as to what should be entered here, you can mouse over the little question mark, and this just pops up a little help balloon. And it tells you it's optional. But this is where we could enter in our on-premise DNS servers if we want them to handle the name resolution of this virtual network, or if we leave it blank, then Azure itself will provide the name resolution. Now again, you can reconfigure this after the fact, so we'll just leave these blank and we'll click on Next. And here you see is the address space window. Now, the quick create gave us some pick lists with respect to the address space. They don't have those here, but you certainly can still change the address space by just typing in the starting IP. So if you prefer to use the 192 or the 172s, you can just type in the address in here. And you see everything will update accordingly, so then we can make our changes. And you see here is where you get a little more flexibility in terms of the size of your subnets. So again, the custom create usually gives you more options. So let's just set this back to the 10 address, just for simplicity's sake. And here again, you see where we only had 5 options in the quick create. Here you have every option right down to the default /8 for a Class A private network. So we'll just leave that at its default size, but of course, let's define a subnet that's much more realistic in terms of its size. So let's create one called S1, and we'll simply start at the first address, and we'll specify fairly standard Class C size of /24, and that gives us up to 255, and we can add in another one and add in another one and keep going for as many as you want. You simply have to click Add Subnet to put in another one. That's all we need for the time being, so we'll just simply click on OK, and that's going to go ahead and create that, and it really shouldn't take probably less than a minute in terms of creating that. And once it has been created, of course, you can go ahead and reconfigure it after the fact. So there you see, in fact, that only took about 10 or 15 seconds. So now I can just click on it, and there you see we have a dashboard. We can configure it from here, where and if we do now want to set up the DNS servers and the point-to-site connectivity for VPN or anything along those lines, or add another subnet, everything certainly can be done after the fact. So, fairly simple process to get started with creating them. Simply supply the values you want, create it, go ahead, modify it after the fact if necessary, but fairly simple to get started with creating your new objects in your Azure environment. In our last demonstration, we saw how to get started with creating a virtual network, but there were also some other methods that you can use to create and define them, and they were right here under the New option. You can see that we had the Quick Create, which we touched on, but there's another one there called Import Configuration, and this uses a network configuration file. So the question then is, well, where does this file come from? Well, the answer is to take your existing virtual network that you have already defined or have access to, and right there you see is the option to export it. So I deleted the one I had just so that we can recreate it, but not before I exported the file. So exporting simply says, where do you want to save it to? And I just tossed it out onto my desktop, and there's the file right there. So let's just pop this open in Notepad, and you can see we have all of the configuration options specified within this file. So I can now recreate the exact same network with exactly these specifications, or if I want to, I could make some alterations, change the name, change the space, change the subnet, anything. It doesn't matter. But the whole idea is simply to make sure that you have this configuration file first, because it allows me in this case now to be able to very quickly and easily recreate the same network if for any reason it was deleted or corrupted somehow. So it almost acts as a backup. Or probably more commonly, I'm just going to send this to somebody else or to another subscription, maybe from my test to my production, to recreate the same type of virtual network. So again, make whatever changes you want. It doesn't really matter for our demonstration purposes here, but as long as you have this file, then we can create a new virtual network using that file. So we'll just click on New, choose the Import Configuration, simply browse for the file. There it is. Open that. Next. There is what's going to happen. VNet1 will be created. Click on OK. And that should go ahead and import that network configuration file and recreate that exact same network. So again, probably in a more realistic scenario, it would be the case where you maybe have this trial environment and a production environment, and anything that we configure in the test location should then be exported out to the production environment. So we just have to export it to a file, alter the file as necessary, re-import the file, and there you see we have everything reconfigured exactly as it was in the original file specifications. So as I said, had I made some changes, they absolutely would be implemented. And in fact, we will see how you can make some alterations using that same file in our next demonstration. But very quick, very easy to create new virtual networks and a number of different objects by using that export option and then simply re-importing that configuration file. With a virtual network created now, we can take a look at some of the management features of this network. And for starters, once you have any kind of object created in Azure, one thing I do like to point out is the help that's available for that object. And we touched on this earlier, but the help that is available is always sensitive to wherever you are. So you can see I'm here in networks and virtual networks in particular, and there is the help section right there. So if we click on this, you see it goes straight to virtual networks. So creating a virtual network here is outlined in all of these options here. There are some links down here about configuring them with the management portal. Information about the net config file, which talks about the network configuration schema. So, there's some additional links here that you can open up and have a look at and just get more information. So again, the help section, always very useful and always sensitive to wherever you are. So there you see example, it takes you straight to the MSDN article for virtual network configuration schema. So it's giving you an idea there about what the file structure is when you go to export this particular file, and we'll discuss that in a moment as well. But again, always a very good resource. Now, with respect to what you have configured here, you can always just click on the object that you've created, and it pulls you into this start screen, basically, where you also have some helpful links to get various tools and learn more about this or that or whatever it is that you're interested in. And you can enable this option to skip the quick start the next time you visit, so it just won't bring you to this screen. But you see at the top here we have a dashboard link, and this just gives you your basic properties. You see a visual diagram of the network. Now there's really nothing configured in this one, of course, so not much to display at this point in time. But it does give you any resources that have been assigned to this virtual network, and it shows you all of the information for that right here. So again, we don't have anything configured yet, but we certainly will as we move through the course. We'll see virtual machines that are assigned to this particular network. And you do see the quick glance status. The subscription ID is there, so we actually did reference that in the PowerShell demonstration. And of course, the location as to where it is. So you get your basic information from the dashboard. And of course, if you need to make changes, you can go to the configure link. And here's where we can do some of those post-creation tasks if they were not done during the creation itself. So we can enter in our DNS servers here and the IP address if we want to enable our own DNS resolution. Here is where we can enable the point-to-site connectivity if we want to set that up. And of course, the actual specifications in terms of the addresses and the subnets can all be redefined here if necessary. Or, of course, I can add another subnet if I need to, add in another entirely separate address space if necessary as well. So all of those changes can be made in here. And depending, of course, on how you have this set up, you may see something available in certificates here. In this case, we won't see anything yet because you see here certificate management is available only when a point-to-site VPN has been configured. Otherwise, there's really nothing to do with certificates as part of this virtual network. But that's where we basically can do our basic management of this particular virtual network. Now, the other thing that you can do is just from the start page here is, of course, to export this configuration into a file, and that's the option that you see right here. So if you click on the export option, You just simply choose the subscription for which this particular network applies. Click on OK, and it's just going to prompt you as to where you want to save the network config file. Save it anywhere, it doesn't matter. It's going to be an XML file, and I've already done this, but there you see is the exact same file right there, network config. So you just have to tell it where you want to place it and save it there, and that will take the configuration of this network and simply export it out to a file, which can then be imported if you go to create a new network. So we can click on New, Network, Virtual Network, Import Configuration, specify the file that we just exported, and that will create another network based entirely on that file. So, in fact, we have already done that in one of the previous demonstrations, but if you wanted to, at any point in time, make alterations to any kind of configuration of an existing network, another option is to simply modify that file once it's been downloaded and then re-import it after the fact, and that will implement the changes to that file as well. So lots of different ways to administer and modify and manage your virtual networks in Azure. We saw earlier how you can create a new virtual network by exporting the existing configuration out to a file, and then you can use that configuration file to import those settings to create a new network. That's in fact how this one here was actually recreated, by using that file. And we still have the file here on our desktop. But now what you can also do is to make alterations to the network configuration by simply changing the contents of the file. So what we'll do in this case now is actually reconfigure this virtual network using that same file. So I'm going to edit this, and we'll make just some fairly simple changes. Let's change the address space to /16 just for the sake of argument. And let's change the name of the subnet to subnet1. And we could probably leave the configuration of the subnet the same. But we've made some changes now, and it doesn't matter what those changes are. And in fact, if you wanted to, within the subnets section here, you could copy all of this code and create a new subnet as well, if you wanted to do that. So, it doesn't really matter. It's up to you with respect to the changes that you might want to implement. But actually, let's go ahead and do that. Let's highlight the whole subnets section here. Copy it. And let's paste in another instance of a subnet. And we'll call this subnet 2. And let's do this. We'll make them each half their size. And this one will start at 128 using the same size. So now we should have two subnets. We have our subnet name of subnet 1 with that address prefix. Then we have subnet 2 with that address prefix. And whoops, I think I need to close off the subnet section after each one of those. That defines each subnet. So we need that there, and then we need subnet there as well. Okay, I think that should do it. And now that we've made these changes, of course, we just need to save this configuration file and then re-import it. So what we should end up with is all of these additional configurations that will effectively overwrite the existing one. So we'll close this and we'll save it. And we'll go back in here. And we could delete this one first, but we don't have to. So we'll just go with the new option. And we'll choose the import configuration. Browse for the same file. Import that. And you can see what's going to happen here is it says update, because it's the same name, VNet1. it's just going to do an update. So we can click on OK, let that import, and we should see the changes get implemented as per whatever you defined in the original file. So that looks like it has been created here. So let's just dismiss all of our completed ones here and OK that. Let's click on the VNet itself, go to our configure option, and let's see if our changes have been implemented. And there we go. Looks good. Our address space was changed to the 16-bit subnet mask. We now have subnet 1 instead of S1. And there's subnet 2 defined exactly as specified as well. So basically, that's how you can modify the any kind of configuration within that file. Now, again, if you aren't entirely certain as to what kind of changes need to be made in the configuration file itself, a good way to do it is to actually go into your portal, make the changes in here, then re-export it and examine the contents of the file and see what's different between that one and the original one. But as long as you're fairly comfortable with how to make the alterations to the configuration file itself, that should work just fine. And that, again, is a pretty good example of where you might take an original file from a test environment, export it out, send it to somebody, let them alter it as per their requirements, and then import it into any given environment, or, of course, to simply make changes to your own environment. Whatever you see fit in terms of the reasons, but that's how you can make your alterations, is to simply modify the configuration file and effectively re-import it. And it will tell you, of course, then that it's simply going to update because we didn't change the name, and that will implement the changes as per your configuration file. Okay, so we have seen most of the basic options with respect to creating and configuring a virtual network. Now we're going to take a look at deploying a virtual machine into that network. So you can see I've gone to the virtual machines option here, and we're going to go ahead and create a new virtual machine. Now, we won't worry too much about all of the configuration options for the virtual machine itself, but we do want to make sure that it gets deployed into the correct virtual network. So you can see here at this point in time, we have the quick create option, and if you hit the drop down right away, you only get the choice for a region here. So again, this kind of comes back to where I mentioned in a previous demonstration that the quick create is just sometimes a little bit limiting, at least with what kind of options you want to define during the creation. You can always go back and change things after the fact, but if you want to right now, at creation time, assign this to a virtual network, there is no option for this here. So in fact, what you might want to do is choose the gallery option. Now again, the quick create will work and you can go back and change it later, but the gallery gives you a little more flexibility and again opens up this multi-page wizard where we can just choose, a few more, or I should say we can see a few more options from which to choose. So we won't worry too much about the configuration of the virtual machine itself here. We just want to focus on getting it deployed into the correct virtual network. So we'll just go with fairly standard default values here. So let's just choose our basic operating system of 2012 data center and choose next. And as far as the release date goes and all of this stuff, we're really going to just leave almost all of it at its default. So we do have to give it a virtual machine name though. So let's just call this VM for virtual machine. But in most cases, you need, for starters, it's telling you it has to be between 3 and 15 characters. And in most cases, we'll see in a moment here, it has to be assigned to a service which needs a unique name. So what you might want to do is come up with some kind of a string of characters that you're fairly certain will be unique. So I'm going to just try today's month and day, which is 0327, and we'll see how that works. Now, as far as the username goes, these typically won't allow what you might consider to be standard usernames either. So just to give you an idea, if I had to try to type in administrator, it will not allow this because it's just too common. And even variations on that, such as admin, also not allowed. Even admin1, not allowed. But I'm going to try to use the same set of characters here, 0327, and it looks like that's okay. Plug in a password, of course. And there's some restrictions on the password as well. But anytime it does throw one of those errors, it will tell you what you are missing. So I think we're good there. Next. Now, every virtual machine requires this cloud service to host it, if you will. Now, we have not yet defined a cloud service, so you see the option is there to create a new one. So the cloud service DNS name will take whatever the virtual machine name is. Now, again, we'll be discussing cloud service and all of these options in much greater detail later on. So again, for the time being, we just want to make sure that the virtual machine is placed into the network. So here is the option that you do not see in the quick create: the region or the affinity group or the virtual network. We only saw the region in the quick create option, so we still have that same choice here for the regions, but because we already have a virtual network defined, which was specified to be in a particular region, then it would be a little bit redundant to put it in the virtual network and then specify a region. We don't have to. There you see is the virtual network that we created, VNet1. We can just select that. It picks up on that, of course, and realizes that there are two subnets that we can use for this one. So let's just put it in subnet 1. And as far as the storage account goes, again, you have the choice here to automatically generate a storage account. And if you want an availability set, you can create one here. But again, the focus of this one was just to specify the correct virtual network. So we're going to leave everything else at their defaults and just click on Next. Install the virtual machine agent if you want to. Again, I'm just going to shorten the time of this to as quickly as possible, but you see there's all kinds of other extensions that can be added if you want to. I'm just going to turn those off for the time being and basically say that that's completed, and this is going to go ahead and start provisioning that. Now, this will take a couple of minutes to complete, so I'm just going to pause and we'll come back once this is completed and we'll verify that it's showing up in the virtual network. Okay, so the provisioning of that virtual machine has completed, and if we check now under the virtual network, we can just click on it, and we see, in fact, there is the virtual machine. It has been provisioned and been assigned an IP address in the first subnet, so we have successfully deployed our virtual machine into the virtual network. In this demonstration, we're going to take a look at configuring another virtual network, but specifically one that has point-to-site VPN connectivity. Now, this does take a bit of time, so I've already configured one, but we will go back and see the wizard shortly. We'll just cancel it and then just compare the configuration of this existing one to what we saw in the wizard. So, with point-to-site VPN connectivity, there's 4 main components that you have to set up. The first one is simply the virtual network, and this is what you're seeing right here. And as far as the virtual network itself goes, it's not really any different than any other virtual network. It's simply a space, a network space defined where you can place virtual machines, various hosts, but of course clients will be able to access this virtual network through a VPN connection. So the second component is how we are going to address the clients when they make a connection. So you can see here that we have this this diagram indicating to us that we have the virtual network and we have the clients. So with a point-to-site connectivity, the clients don't have any kind of physical device because they could be scattered anywhere around the world. They just simply use a software application on their system to establish connectivity into the VPN, but we do have to configure how they're going to be addressed. The third component you see here is the gateway, and there is the gateway IP address right there, and I will tell you that when you go to define these, this is the longest step. For whatever reason, at least in my case, this took about 20 minutes to configure the gateway. There's nothing complicated to it. You simply click a button, but you don't have any control over what address gets assigned.
But you do see that this is a publicly available address that clients can access from anywhere on the internet. So those are the first three components that have to be set up, and then the last one is actually certificates, because of course your clients are connecting to ultimately internet-based systems, so you have to set up certificates. So we'll go over all of those components with respect to how you set them up by having a look at the wizard here, and then we'll just cancel the wizard because again it does take a bit of time. So you want to go to your network services, virtual network, custom create, and the name, in this case, I'll just put in test because we're not going to actually use this one. Location won't matter. DNS servers, same as before. You can put in your own DNS servers or you can leave it blank and allow Azure to perform the resolution. But there you see is the option for configuring point-to-site VPN. So you just have to enable that and you see the additional components have come into play here. So there we have the clients, the gateway, and now the virtual network, of course. Click on Next. And you see that this is now highlighted in yellow, indicating it's wanting us to configure the address space for the clients when they connect. Now, this can pretty much be anything, but in my configuration, I already used 10.0.0.0 in my first virtual network. So just to keep it separate, I use 10.0.1.0. But really, it can be anything. The only requirement is that it be a private address. So you can see here, those are the private address ranges. You specify whatever you feel is necessary for the client configuration, and of course the size needs to be applicable or appropriate for the number of VPN clients that you'll have connected in at any one time. The next page, we see now the address space for the virtual network has gone out and grabbed the next available space. And again, in my case, since I used 10.0.1 on the previous page for the clients, mine came in at 10.0.2. That's fine. And again, you basically just have to make sure that you create an appropriately sized space for the virtual machines that are going to reside in the virtual network. But it does have to be configured in subnets. So you see here, subnet 1 came in at a /27, so only 32 hosts. Now, that gives us the valid address range of 0 through 31. This is absolutely fine, but you have to add in a gateway subnet. Now, you can just click this button, and it's going to create a new subnet, but it's only going to come in at, I think, a /29, if I'm not mistaken. I believe 29, and that gives us only 8 hosts. And it's going to grab the range of 32 up to 40. That's perfectly fine. That will work, but I do see a lot of production environments, they prefer to have the gateway in the first few addresses of the subnet. Entirely optional, but I did do exactly that just to kind of mimic a production environment. So what I did was I just left this at the default size, and again, you can determine that for yourself, but I put my clients at 32 to 63. Watch what happens when I click Gateway Subnet now. You can see it actually went out and grabbed the first few addresses. So again, that's entirely your call. There's no requirement for that, but a lot of environments I do see like to have the gateway in the first few addresses. Entirely up to you. And that's it. That's the last page of the configuration with respect to the wizard. So we can just cancel this. It will go ahead and create everything, and you'll end up with basically this. So if I click my configure tab here now, we can see that here are the addresses that I use. So again, my clients are going to get addresses in the 10.0.1 address space, and I just left it at its default size because I don't have any real clients, but this, is usually fine for a lot of environments. And then the virtual network address space, you see, is 10.0.2, and again, I just left it at its default size. But the subnet configuration there, you see the gateways using the first few addresses, and then the clients are allocated from 36 up to 62. And do take note, the first valid address here is 4. Again, that's just Azure reserving the first few addresses for various internal purposes, so don't be too surprised about that. But you see that it's pretty much the same configuration that I set up in the wizard. So that's just the addressing. Then the last couple of options then back on the dashboard page, you have to assign the gateway, and you have to create the certificates. So there you see is the gateway address, and the only thing you have to do for this is simply click this button here. But of course, I already have one, so the button is Delete Gateway. When your wizard finishes, this button will be Add Gateway. And again, there's nothing to configure. You simply click Add Gateway. It will set this up for you. And again, you have no control over what address you're going to receive. And it does take quite a while. Again, mine took almost 20 minutes to set up the gateway. But as long as you have the time to do that, that's no problem. Just let it go about its business, and you can do other things while it's creating the gateway. Finally, the last step is the certificates, and there you see again is My Root Certificate, and you can get a little bit of extra help here if you just go through the help system. It's a few links in, but right there is configuring a point-to-site VPN connection in Azure, and if you just scroll down a little bit, you'll see what you need is a self-signed root certificate. So you can create these using MakeCert. You can get MakeCert either by installing this right here, which is free, and then once you have that, you can just locate the executable of MakeCert itself, copy it to a folder, any folder, it doesn't matter, then launch a command prompt as an administrator, and then simply switch to that folder. So I did exactly that. I created a folder simply called Certificates. There's the MakeCert utility, so I launched a command prompt as an administrator, changed to this directory, and then simply executed this exact code. And there you see is the copy right there, so you can paste it into your command prompt. And the only thing I did was to change the name. Both here, it says root certificate name, and here, I simply replaced both of those with My Root Certificate. Once you have this file, then you simply upload it into Azure. And there you see is the upload option. Just click on that, browse for the file, upload this certificate. This establishes trust between the Azure environment and the clients. So it only supports, in fact, self-signed certificates at this point. So third-party, publicly trusted ones aren't yet available. But once you have that in place, this will download the certificate to the clients and establish, of course, a secure session. So again, set up your virtual network. Make sure you enable the option for point-to-site VPN connectivity. Configure the virtual network however you see fit. Configure the client addressing. Add your gateway. Upload your certificate. And you've got a completed virtual network with point-to-site connectivity. Okay, so previously we set up a virtual network with point-to-site VPN connectivity. In this demonstration, we'll set up another one, but with site-to-site VPN connectivity, and we'll see what the difference is between the two. So we'll just get started by clicking New. And again, it's Virtual Network Custom Create. And we'll call this one S2S VPN for Site-to-Site VPN. And we'll keep the same location as before. Click on Next. The DNS server, same deal, will just allow Azure to perform name resolution for us. So here basically is the difference. Obviously, you just choose the option here, but recall with point-to-site VPN, it was just a collection of clients that can be anywhere. So there's no single or centralized location from which the clients access the VPN. They just use a software client on their machine. So the other option with site-to-site, with this you see a new local network has to be defined. So the idea here is that all of the clients that are going to access this VPN are in the same network. Therefore, they go through this VPN device here. So similar to having to configure a gateway on the Azure side, we have to set up a VPN device on your side, if you will, to act as the connecting point between the two. So this is, in essence, a gateway-to-gateway VPN, or hence the term site-to-site. So we're going to have to define a new local network for the clients and configure an IP address for the VPN device. So when we click Next, this is exactly what is being asked of us on this page. Again, it's highlighting the new local network and is requiring the VPN device IP address. It also wants a name, so we can still call this whatever we want, but let's call this local
net 1. And then as far as the VPN device goes, if you click on the or mouse over the help option here, again you see enter the IP address of the local router, but it needs to have the public address, the one that is facing Azure, entered in here. So again, it's the one on the outside, if you will, pointing to the gateway. So this needs to be a publicly available address. Now, I don't actually have a device here in my lab environment, so I'm just going to make up a public IP that will suffice in terms of creating it, but this does need to be a public address. Now, the address space that's used in this local network is, of course, a private address space. So I'm just going to go with the fairly standard 192 configuration. The default mask for the Class C. I don't need to worry about the size or anything like that, so we'll do a /24. And that's the address space, again, that is being used internally by these clients. So this is where basically all the difference comes in. The point to site does not require any of this. It's just scattered clients. So we'll click on next. From this point, it is exactly the same as the point to site because all we're doing now is setting up the virtual network address configuration. So what I'm going to do is I've already used 10.0.1, 2, and 3. I've used 0, 1, and 2. So I'm going to make this one 3 just to keep them separate. And I'm going to go again with the fairly standard /24 because I'm not really concerned with the size. And in terms of the subnet, we also have to do the exact same thing as before. We need a subnet for the hosts that will reside in this virtual network, and we need a gateway subnet. So I'm going to do the same thing as I did before and just place the gateway on the first few addresses. So I'm just going to increment this. You see 31 is the current end with that subnet mask. I certainly could change that if I want to, but it's fine for my purposes here. So I'm going to start my clients at 32. And then I'm going to add the gateway subnet so it grabs the first few addresses of the subnet. Again, configure that however you see fit. The gateway subnet by no means has to be the first few addresses. It's just common. So that's pretty much all that we need to do. The configuration is complete. That's the last page. And this should set up in probably only less than a minute or so. But the same thing has to be done for the site-to-site VPN, as does the point-to-site, in that you have to have a gateway. So even though it says created here, it's still thinking about that for a minute, but we'll just let that go and quickly go back to the point-to-site VPN. And just recall that in this one, we had to set up this gateway IP address, and there's nothing to that. You simply click the Add Gateway button. In my case, it's delete gateway because it's obviously there already in this one. But that does take quite some time. And again, there's nothing you have to configure. You simply click create gateway. It will assign this address automatically. It just takes a lot of time, so we won't bother actually waiting for that in this demonstration. But certificates, actually, in this case, you see, we had to upload certificates that download to the clients when they're establishing their session. But when you're using a point to site, it actually does not use certificates in this case. The security is set up between the two devices. So if we go back to our site to site, certificate management, you see, is only available when a point to site has been configured. So there's nothing to do with respect to certificates, at least in terms of having it download to clients. You set up the security, again, between the devices. So the only other thing that we have to do is still create the gateway. So there you see is the option to create it. Again, I can go ahead and just click on this, but it does take about 20 minutes in most cases to create the gateway. So we'll just leave that as is, and we'll worry about the gateway a little bit later. But for the time being, that is how you set up your site-to-site VPN. Just make sure you configure a local network, a public IP address for the VPN device, and then once you're done, add in your gateway. And then finally, you will see here we have local net 1. So if I go to configure I will see that there is a setup here for the local network, and there it is right there, so I can choose that. But if I just go back to my overall networks page, there you see now is local networks, and there's the local net right there. So that basically, again, is how my clients are configured within my local environment. And then that, of course, connects through the VPN device through to the gateway. So a few extra components, but setting up the virtual network with site-to-site VPN connectivity only requires just a few more steps. And then finally, just add in your gateway, and you're ready to start using it. We've seen now how to set up virtual networks and how to configure VPN access into those virtual networks. And in this demonstration, we're going to see how to create and configure another connectivity option, which is the VNet to VNet connection. Now, this is a little bit lengthy, so we're going to break this up into 3 different demonstrations. The first one will configure the VNets themselves. In the second one, we'll create gateways and add in a shared key for security. And then in the third one, we'll test it out to make sure that it works, of course, and see how to make the connection itself. So what I've done in terms of setting this up, I've actually removed the existing virtual networks that I'd previously set up, just so that we completely start from scratch. So the first thing we need is 2 virtual networks. So we're just going to click on New. And we're going to go with our custom create option, and we'll just call this VNet 1 again. That's fine, and we'll place this in the eastern US, and we'll click next. We don't need any DNS information, and we don't need any VPN connectivity, but I will tell you at this point, the VNet to VNet configuration is actually considered to be a site-to-site connection. So we're going to set things up similarly to what we did for a site-to-site VPN, but it doesn't require the VPN option. But just to quickly show you, when you enable this option, you end up with a local network. So you do still actually have to create more local networks to set this up, but again, it's not a VPN. So we're just going to uncheck this. Just kind of hold that thought for the time being. Next. For my first one, I'll go with the same 10 address space, but I'll put it back to a more manageable size, the /24. Now, what I'm going to do in terms of the subnet configuration is the same thing I did for the VPN connections. Since it is still treated as a site-to-site connection, there is going to have to be a subnet for the gateway. So I'm just going to leave it as it is for now, but I'm going to sort of anticipate a little bit. Again, just to give you an idea that I like the preference of having the gateway in the first few client addresses. So what I'm going to do is just think ahead a little bit here, and I'm going to start subnet 1 at 32. And I'm going to leave it at /27, and again, obviously, you can set your sizes however you see fit, but this places the host machines that will be in this virtual network in the 32 to 63 range, and then when the gateway subnet gets created, it'll grab the first few addresses of the subnet. Again, purely a personal preference of mine. But that's all we need to set up for now. Click on OK, and then we're going to go right ahead and start another one. And it's still a custom create, and this is going to be VNet 2. And you know what? We'll go ahead and put this one in the western location just to keep it separate and kind of simulate a little more of a production environment, and choose next. And we're going to leave the DNS blank. Again, same thing. Next. But let's change it up a bit here. Let's go with the 172.16 space just to change things up a little bit. And we'll still go with the /24 for a more manageable size. And then we'll do the same thing with the subnet configuration. We'll place our host addresses for the VNet after the 32 address, leaving space for a gateway subnet to grab the first few. Click OK. And that's going to go ahead and create our first 2 virtual networks. Now, the other thing that has to be done, I kind of mentioned this earlier, you do actually have to set up local networks because the option of VNet to VNet does treat it as a site-to-site.
So a little bit of trickery is involved here, if you will. You can't just flip a nice little switch and say connect VNet 1 to VNet 2. It just doesn't work that way. So what we have to do is set up local networks that completely mirror the configuration of these two. So we can let those go ahead and, well, it looks like they have completed, in fact, already. Yes, successfully completed both, so that's good. So I will show you the option here. Let's go to VNet 1, and we'll choose Configure. And here you see is where you enable it. You see connect to the local network under site-to-site connectivity. So this, in essence, is the VNet to VNet. So once we enable this, which I won't do yet, but once we do that, the gateway subnet will automatically appear down here. So what we need to do now is actually go back and create local networks that completely mirror the setup of the original two. Now this is the one that I used for the VPN, so we'll just ignore that. But we are going to go with new, and we're going to add in a local network. And let's call this actually, you know what, just L for local, VNet 1. Now, the VPN device IP address. I mentioned that it's not really the VPN type of connection that we saw earlier. It's not the point-to-site, but it is still a site-to-site connection. So you do have to have a VPN device address. But you see here it says optional. That is simply meaning that you don't have to enter it now. Sooner or later you will. But one of the approaches you can take is to just put in a temporary placeholder address. But again, you don't have to. But I'm going to go that route just to kind of show you what it ends up looking like. So for local VNet 1, I'm just going to put in 1.1.1.1. Okay, and this is not going to be used, so it doesn't matter. But I like having that temporary placeholder, if you will, just to sort of see where you are. So we're going to click Next. And the address space for this local virtual network needs to exactly match the virtual network. So it's 10.0.0.0 for my first one with the /24. Normally, in a lot of network configurations in Azure, you don't want any overlap, but for this to work, it actually has to be identical. So we're going to click OK, and then we're going to do the exact same thing, new, local network, and this will be LVNet 2. And its address will be 2.2.2.2. And again, this is not going to be used. Next. And the address space needs to be identical, 172.16.0.0 with the /24. And we have the necessary building blocks in place, if you will. So those are the first 4 things that are required. 2 virtual networks, VNet 1 and VNet 2, and with whatever IP configurations you feel are appropriate. But again, sort of anticipate the subnet configuration that's going to be set up. So you have to have that gateway subnet available. So that's basically only just allowing some space within the entire network space. In other words, the first subnet should not take up the entire network space. So that's exactly what we have. We have VNet 1 and 2. Then under local networks, we have LVNet 1 and LVNet 2. And again, they must identically match the address space. And it looks like they've completed as well. So that's the first few steps that are required. So we'll see in the next demonstration how to create the gateways and, of course, configure the connection and then set up the shared keys. Continuing on with our VNet to VNet configuration, we've successfully created our 2 VNets. And again, they're in totally separate geographical regions, and they have different configurations in terms of their address space, but we're going to set them up, of course, to actually see each other. Then the other component that was required were local networks, because this is treated as a site-to-site connection. So the local networks identically match up the virtual networks. So the LVNets are the local ones, again with their same address spaces as the virtuals, but again note the VPN gateway address just temporarily using the 1.1.1 and the 2.2.2, but we will change this coming up shortly. So what we need to do now, the next step, is to go back to the virtual networks and go to each virtual network. And on the configure page, we have to set it up to connect to the local network, which represents the other VNet. So if we scroll down, you'll see there's the site-to-site connectivity option, and we do want to connect to the local network. So we enable this feature. To take note of what happened, as I mentioned, immediately the gateway subnet gets created. And again, this is simply why I put my host addresses up a little higher, so that the gateway would grab the lower addresses. So that happened by default, and right away I didn't have to set that up at all. It was simply because those addresses were available that I went out and grabbed them. So now what of course we have to specify is which local network. Well, VNet 1 wants to connect to VNet 2. VNet 2 is, in essence, as far as our configuration goes, is LVNet 2, the local one. So if we hit the drop down, there you see are the two options. So we want 1 to connect to 2, and we want 2 to connect to 1. So we have to do that on both sides. So we're going to save this. That's going to take a moment to update. So we can go now to VNet 2, and we're going to go to its configure page, and we're going to do the exact same thing. And again, watch, you see there's no gateway subnet here, so we're going to connect to the local network. The gateway subnet appeared automatically. There's the lower addresses being grabbed. And we want VNet 2 to connect to LVNet 1. So you have to do this on both ends. And we're just going to save this. Okay, so the first one has updated. This shouldn't take too long. But now the next step is to create the gateways. And we'll pause the recording, of course, once this happens. But I will tell you, creating the gateways can take anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes. So just be prepared for a bit of a wait once you enable the gateway option. So we're going to go ahead and just let this one complete here. This shouldn't take too long. So while we're waiting, let's just go back and make sure that VNet 1 on its configure page is now showing to connect to LVNet 2. So yes, it is. So that looks good. There, the other one has completed its update. So let's go back to VNet 2 and its configure page, and we should see LVNet 1. So that's the first step in getting the two to see each other. Now what you need to do is go back to the dashboard pages for each one. So let's pull this up, and there you see it's already showing up, the option to create the gateway. So now VNet 1 is showing that it wants to connect to local VNet 2, which is the exact same address configuration. So this is the VNet, but we need a gateway. So we're going to click on Create Gateway, and note that you have these two choices here for static or dynamic routing for VNet to VNet connections. It must be dynamic. Okay, so we're going to click Create Gateway, choose Dynamic Routing, say yes. That's going to go about its business, and now we can right away go to VNet 2, and we should see the same thing. There's no gateway. So we're going to say Create Gateway, Dynamic Routing, yes. Okay, so those are both going about their business now, and this is the point where this will take, as mentioned, about 15 to 30 minutes. So we'll just pause the recording at this point, and we'll come back once those have been completed. And then the next thing we have to do is add in the shared key to establish the security, and then in our final demonstration, we'll connect it all and test it out. So again, we'll pause for a moment here and come back once those have completed. Okay, so our gateways have been defined for both VNet 1 and 2, and you can see we have been given a publicly available address here for each VNet. And what we need to do now is to take these addresses and change the value of the VPN device in the local networks to reflect these values. So for VNet1, what we're going to do is just copy this address and paste it into the VPN address of the local network one. And I'm not sure why this is taking so long to spin up here. Let's go back to VNet2, see if this comes up a bit quicker. Okay, these don't want to seem to refresh. I'm going to pause and let these refresh here and come back in a second. Okay, just a little refresh issue there. So for VNet1, we have this gateway address. So what we're going to do is just copy this, and we're going to go back to our local networks. And for local VNet1, we're going to get rid of this invalid address here by simply clicking on Edit. And we're going to paste in the correct address for the VPN device. Click on Next. And click on OK, and that will update. That will take a minute or two. So we'll go back to the virtual networks and go to VNet2. And we're basically going to do the exact same thing. We're just going to grab the publicly assigned address for this one. And we're going to copy that and go back to our local networks. And we're going to update local VNet2 in the same fashion. So we'll paste in those valid addresses now, and each one of those will update so that it now has an actual valid connection point between the two. Now, those will take a moment to update as well, so we're going to pause yet again and let those complete, and then we'll just verify all the configuration before we move on to the final step. Okay, so our local VNets have now updated with the correct VPN gateway addresses for each one. So now we're ready to set up the shared key, and that'll be the last step in terms of configuration. Then we'll verify everything. Now, as far as setting up the shared key goes, you want to do this actually from PowerShell. So I've already opened up my PowerShell ISE here, and I've done my Add Azure account to sign in with the appropriate account. So here's the code already set to go for both of those. Set Azure VNet Gateway Key with the argument of the VNet name, which is VNet1. Then it is wanting to know the local network site name, which is local VNet2. So 1 connects to 2. 2 connects to 1. So we can run each of these to make sure that that gets established. And as for the shared key, of course, you can just put in anything that you want there. Now, each of these will actually take a moment as well. So let's just do one more pause, and we'll run the second one and make sure that those have both run successfully. Okay, so we can see both PowerShell commands have been run, and we see a status of OK for both of them. And again, you can see that VNet1 here connected to LVNet2, and then VNet2 to LVNet1. And in both cases, we got our status of OK, so our shared key has been established. So we are now ready to connect the two and test these out, which we'll do in our last demonstration. So our last step here is to test everything to make sure that the VNet to VNet connections are working. So let's quickly recap. We established 2 VNets and set up the addressing however you see fit. Then we also had to set up 2 local VNets, which exactly mirrored the address configuration of its counterpart VNet. So we see that again if we go back to our networks page. There's the local networks. So then we had to make sure that we assigned the appropriate VPN gateway address once we actually got the gateways configured for each VNet. So once that was done, we went into our PowerShell and we set up a shared key for both sides, so that again, VNet1 connects to LVNet2 and vice versa down here using the same shared key. And that, of course, establishes the security.
So the last step is to simply make the connection. So we see it's unable to establish here, but that's to be expected. Although I will tell you, just from experience, I have seen these come in a connected state after running this PowerShell commandlet here. So it hasn't happened every time, but it certainly has from time to time. So I'm not really sure why that isn't consistent, but don't be too surprised if you actually see them already connected. So all we need to do now is select the appropriate VNet here, and right there you see is the connect button. So we'll just click on that. That's going to go about its business of establishing the connection. That shouldn't take too long. And then we have to do the same thing for VNet 2. So we're going to go ahead and hit the connect button there. And we see the first one has successfully enabled the connection, so that's good. And we'll just give that a second or two to complete that one, although we can dismiss that and just let that go about its business. So if we go back to VNet 1 here, that one established the connection, although I think we probably need to make sure that, that we wait for both of them to connect. And I also have seen this require a couple of refreshes before it does actually show a successful connection. But let's let them both complete here, and we'll just make sure that we do get this refreshed. What will happen, of course, is this will no longer show the red border around it, and obviously the connection status here will not say that it is in a disconnected state. Okay, so that one successfully enabled as well. So let's just click on OK, and let's see if VNet 2 refreshed correctly here. And like I said, sometimes I've had to refresh the entire page. I'm not entirely certain, again, why it's not always consistent, but it does take a few attempts in some cases to actually establish the connection. So I've seen that happen before, and in fact, I'm thinking that that is probably what's happening here. Taking a while to spin up here, and in fact, you see the connect button is still an option. Had it connected successfully, this should say disconnect. So let's go back and see what VNet 1 is at. So still showing me a connect button here. So they are a bit finicky from time to time. So this isn't too surprising. I'm going to give this a minute. I'm going to pause, and we'll just come back and see what happens after these refresh. Okay, we got a 50% success rate here. I just did a complete refresh of the whole page, and VNet 2 is showing a successful connection now to LVNet 1. And here's the proof, if you will. We're seeing data in and data out. So there's actually some exchanges going on, even though there's no actual virtual machines. In essence, these are the gateways talking to each other. So that one has connected successfully, and again, we see the red border is gone. And clearly we have a disconnect option now. So that one looks good. This is only here because I refreshed the page, so let's dismiss that. But let's go back to VNet 1, and we'll see if maybe, oh, there we go. So that one has now succeeded as well. So that's, of course, what you want to see. And as mentioned, if you encounter a similar problem, just try connecting again. Maybe refresh the entire page, possibly as much as signing out and signing back in again. But that should be everything that's required. So if for any reason they aren't connecting, certainly verify the IP addresses in the local networks. Make sure that they are correct and that you didn't mistakenly put the wrong gateway in the wrong network. You know, the gateway for VNet 1 should be added into LVNet 1. And the gateway for VNet 2 should be added into LVNet 2. And of course, make sure your PowerShell script ran successfully and that you got the OK status code for both of them. And again, you have to run it for both to establish the two-way connectivity, if you will. But once all of that's done and you're seeing data in and data out, then those two VNets have connected to each other, and you've successfully set up a VNet to VNet connection. Okay, time for some hands-on now, and what we're going to do is ask you to create a virtual network, configure a site-to-site VPN, and then finally configure a VNet to VNet connection. Now, obviously, feel free to go back and review previous demonstrations, but what we'll ask you to do now is to pause the recording and take some time to complete these exercises, and then come back, and what we'll do is compare what you've created to a new creation that I'll do in Azure, and review some of the settings. So as mentioned, go ahead and pause the recording now, and we'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, so if you have completed all of your exercises, then what you defined should resemble what you see here. Now, we'll start with just the plain regular VNet, if you will, and that is right here, VNet 1. Now, when you define a VNet, really the only thing you need to concern yourself with is the address, of course. So on the configure page, we can just check to see the address configuration here, and obviously yours does not have to match this. You can set up whatever address you feel to be appropriate. But I went with the 10.0.4 address space with the standard 24 subnet mask, and the subnet here is also entirely optional. I just put that in to demonstrate that, of course, you can further divide your address space up into smaller subnets if desired. There's no connections here to anything else for just a VNet. Really, the only thing that you would set up a standard VNet for would be to place virtual machines in Azure inside the VNet. So that's really all that's required for that. And to get started on a new one, we just have to click New and choose Quick Create or Custom, and simply supply those values. As for the site-to-site VPN, you do require two components here. The VPN side, which I guess, for all intents and purposes, you can call in Azure, and then a network that represents your own site, your physical location. So what we have here is the site-to-site VPN, which represents the Azure side of things. So again, the main thing you need to concern yourself with is what kind of address space you're going to use. And again, that can be anything. But with this, you do have to have at least one subnet defined for your gateway. There needs to be gateways on both sides, your side and the Azure side. So what I did here was to define another subnet just for hosts on this virtual network. And you can see they're in the upper ranges here of 36 to 62. And again, this is only a personal preference, wherein I like to leave some available spaces for the gateway subnet when it gets created. That places my gateway down in the lower address ranges. And again, that's just a personal preference. But you do have to have the gateway subnet. So that happens automatically during the configuration of the wizard when it asks you to configure the local side. So you can see what happens here is it is connected to a local network. And the local network you can find back from our main page right there. There you see is the VPN net. And that's been set up with a standard 192.168. But the VPN gateway address does need to be, of course, a valid public IP address for this to actually work in practice. Now, again, in my lab, I don't have one, so I just put in an invalid address for the time being, or I should say just a made-up address. So I can't actually connect mine, but that's all you would need would be a valid public IP so that you can connect the two. Now, as far as the virtual network to virtual network goes, recall that you need 4 components to make this work. 2 virtual networks that are more or less the same as our first virtual network, but then you also need 2 local networks, because the virtual network to virtual network is actually treated like a site-to-site connection. So you need local VNets to represent the other side, we'll call it. So you have to set up your first 2 virtual networks, again, with any address space that you want. That's your call. But you do need to sort of take note of what that address space is going to be, because the local network that you set up has to mirror it exactly. So you can see my v2 vnet 1 is using 10.0.5 with the same subnet configuration as we saw earlier, leaving some space in the lower ranges for the gateway. Virtual to virtual network 2 is using a 172 address, just to be different. Really, that's all that's for, but the same idea. The lower addresses were reserved for the gateway. Then what you have to do is to define two local networks that have the exact same configuration. So on the local networks page, we would click on New and choose Local Network, and then configure those with the exact same address spaces as the other two virtual networks. So those are identical. Then the VPN gateway address you will be prompted for, but again, you can just put in a temporary placeholder address. So that's what I have here, because those will be edited later on once you create the gateways in Azure. That will assign the valid addresses, and then you can just edit these values by simply clicking Edit and putting in the valid address once Azure creates it. So with those four in place, we would go back to our virtual networks and then select each one of these, and on the configure page, you have to make sure that you go down and you specify site-to-site connectivity, connect to the local network. So virtual to virtual network 1 connects to local VNet 2, and vice versa. Virtual to virtual network 2 connects to local VNet 1. And that's how you set up the VNet to VNet. Now from that point, you also have to remember to go to your dashboard pages, create the routers, the gateways. That takes some time, and then connect the two just by simply clicking on the connect button. And that will establish the connection. And if finally you want to secure that connection, you can run the following PowerShell script right here. Set Azure VNet Gateway, specify the name of the virtual and the name of the local, and then specify a shared key, and do that for both sides, and that will secure the connection so that obviously we can transfer information across that in a secure fashion.